Hi, I'm Mike Winkler, and I'm the Principal Managing Broker for Coldwell Banker Bain in Issaquah, Washington.
And I'm E.J. Bolds. I'm the Principal Managing Broker for Coldwell Banker Bain on Mercer Island, Washington.
Last week, we talked about the closing process. So
That's
guess
right.
what?
I give up.
We're going to talk about the costs associated with the closing process, or...
Closing costs.
Yes.
Wonderful segue.
Yes,
Mike.
thank you.
Every real estate transaction has specific costs for both the buyer and the seller. So in addition to the purchase price that the buyer pays and that the seller receives, both parties have to be aware of the other costs that they will occur. In Washington, we have contractual and logistical processes that we use to deal with these closing costs. And the idea is that all parties are going to know about these closing costs before they sign a purchase and sale agreement.
And we'll talk about how you can do that in a minute.
Okay.
But first, there are basically three categories of closing costs. The costs associated with the buyer, which are generally related to the to obtaining the purchase loan, and then also including the settlement costs. Costs associated with the seller, which include brokerage fees, excise tax, and settlement costs. And costs associated with the property, which include proration of taxes, rents, and/or homeowners association dues.
And the buyer's costs when they're getting a loan are very well documented. There's a federal regulation that says that when a buyer applies for a loan, they have to get what's called a truth in lending statement. That statement will tell them all the costs associated with closing the loan and also the costs involved in paying off the loan. And of course, a cash purchase has much lower closing costs than a purchase involving a loan. Including in what we call closing costs are the category of what we call settlement fees. And the settlement fees are fees that are paid to the lender, to the title insurance company who insures the title, and to the escrow company who actually will close the loan. And the settlement fees of title and escrow are generally split equally between the buyer and the seller, with the one exception that in a VA guaranteed loan, when a buyer is getting a VA guaranteed loan, the seller has to pay the entire escrow fee.
The seller's costs, as I mentioned, include the brokerage fee, which is paid to the listing firm and is generally shared with the selling firm, so it's considered the commission. The selling firm represents the buyer. Another substantial cost in Washington State is our excise tax. Generally 1.78%, although it can vary by county, so it's something that needs to be researched. The seller, as EJ mentioned, pays their share of settlement costs for title and escrow. Each party's settlement costs or charge can equal about 1% of the purchase loan. We already mentioned the third category of closing costs, and that's related to the property, which includes proration of taxes, assessment, and rents, if applicable. And of course, proration means that the seller is responsible for the cost up until the day of closing, and the buyer is responsible after closing.
That's right. And the Northwest Multiple Purchase and Sale Agreement discusses closing costs and actually sets up a term of the contract, if you will, that the buyer and seller will pay their representative closing costs. And so closing costs are, and it actually defines what many of those closing costs are going to be. So closing costs are handled generally in a standardized way. And the one variable might be whether or not a seller would pay part of the buyer's closing costs as part of the negotiations when they put together the transaction.
These costs shouldn't be a mystery. In fact, the entire process is set up so that there should be no surprises when you get there, from the truth in lending provisions to a competent real estate broker providing the buyer advice and giving them the closing costs. And there are computer programs in most of the multiples there are in the Northwest MLS that allow the real estate broker to calculate what those closing costs are going to be. It does require accurate input from the prospective buyer.
Right.
And conversely, the seller should have no surprises either, because a seller should request a net seller proceeds, which will factor in all of the components that we've talked about, so that the seller can know when it closes, even to the day, essentially what their costs are going to be. So under the no surprises rule, our rule, you should, if you're a buyer or a seller, you should ask your real estate broker if they haven't already offered that information.
I'm E.J. Wold.
I'm Mike Winkler. Till next time.